You see, South Asians love to tell stories. We can't do without stories. Ajay mentioned one story that when we were working together on water, I'll tell you something very interesting happened in that journey. And this was when we were writing the first manifesto, South Asian Manifesto on Water. Well, myself, Ashish Nandi, and when Ajay, he took us to the outskirts of Kathmandu, to up in the mountains, in fact, to show how the mountain people live with water. Because before writing the manifesto, we had to travel quite extensively to know how people use water. Now, once we were in the mountain, the doel was singing. This is the magpie robin. And so Ajay said, well, the doel invites you all. I immediately said, who gave this doel the visa? Because doel is the national bird of Bangladesh. And Ajay said, this is really funny, First you demand our water, now you demand our birds also. Well, the poor doel, I'm sure, had no knowledge that, it is the national bird of Bangladesh. And I can go on, making fun of national bird and national animals and all those national things, but I'll stick to today's topic. The second thing that Ajay said, let me, on the issue of Nepal and Bangladesh, or mountains and delta getting connected, there's an interesting story too. I was in Lhasa last year, trying to look at the Yalung Sangpo. I'm trying to write a book with one of my good friend from India, Sanjay Hazarika, on the Brahmaputra. So I needed to see Yalung Sangpo. So I went to Lhasa, in fact, and there I said, you people could actually claim part of the sovereignty of Bangladesh. And they were very happy, in fact, because I said, your silt comes all the way to Bangladesh, and that is what made the delta, that is what made Bengal, And then as they were clapping, I said, well, but then we can make a counter claim of your sovereignty, because our water falls down as snow and rainwater on you. And this is how we get connected. And this is how we get connected, not with only Lhasa, but also we get connected with all the mountains, in fact, including Nepal. And that tells you that there are interesting things, in fact. In trying to look at Dhaka, one can get sense of other cities, and I believe also Kathmandu. Now, the paper is in front of you. I'm sure you are going to read at one point of time. And I always say that I never use PowerPoint because I'm a powerless, pointless person. So, and that becomes another problem. So I'll just speak out the time that I've been given to give you a sense of what I have written, though I'm not going to read out the entire thing. That would be utterly boring. Now, Dhaka, if you look at the birth of Dhaka, particularly the naming of Dhaka, it is mysterious. And mystery comes from the very word Dhaka, because some people say that it has some relationship with the hidden goddess Dhakeshwari, the Ishwar that was covered, let's put it that way. And the Dhakeshwari Mandir is still there, in fact. You can go to Dhaka and visit there. Now, that is interesting. There are other people who would say, well, the name could have come from the sound of the drums, but then drums and Dhakeshwari are also related. As you know, during the puja, you have the drums beating. So all things made this whole naming of the city very mysterious. Now, as to its origins, 400 years, 600 years, some say 6th century AD. Now, we can go as far back. But what I think people all have agreed, that it could not have come about without rivers. And the whole Dhaka city is surrounded by rivers, in fact. You get the Buriganga River, the south, you get Balu and Shitalokha in the east, and not to mention you get Turag in the west, and in the north you get the Tongi Canal. So it's actually surrounded by the river. It used to be a hydrological city, and no doubt back in the late 19th century when James Taylor visited Bengal, he thought he was looking at Venice, in fact. So it is regarded, this is what he said, with its minarets and spacious buildings like that of Venice in the west. Bangkok also has that same kind of understanding. In fact, people used to refer to Bangkok also as Venice, in fact. So these are hydrological cities, and as you know, Bangkok is also part of the delta. Now, hydrological cities somehow got transformed into a land-centric city, and that is where I think the problem started, and also I believe solution lies if we want to remake Dhaka and other cities of the world, other cities of South Asia particularly. Now, when it comes to rivers or when it comes to city, the first thing that you need to flag is the people, because what are rivers for, or even a city without people? And that reminds me of a dialogue between Einstein and Tagore. And this is the dialogue between a physicist and a poet, a mystic poet, around 1934. Now, the debate was on the issue whether beauty or truth or even the table, and by implication whether the moon could exist without human beings. Tagore answered no, emphatically no. Einstein immediately responded by saying, well, beauty I can understand. And this was very easy to understand because, we don't know how one dog looks at another dog, or one cow looks at another cow saying, oh, you are beautiful. We don't know yet, okay? So that Einstein understood very easily that beauty there has to be some human being to say that it's beautiful. But then he was not sure about truth. He said, truth? Tagore said, yes. Because truth is realized through human beings. Who's going to say whether this is true or false? It's only humans. You don't expect an ant to say, oh, this is true, because we really don't know how they, talk and how they negotiate. And the table could be understood also because we really don't know how other animals look at this table. The moon, for example. We know it is the moon. And the debate went on. At the very end, in fact, Einstein ended by saying, and this is his saying to Tagore, that it seems I am more religious than you are, full stop. So there is, the physicists had to surrender, in fact, to Tagore. Now that tells you, no human beings, no city, no rivers, no Dhaka, no Kathmandu, nothing. It's only humans can make a city and remake cities, everywhere. Now the transformation of Dhaka city is really interesting because back in 19th century, when the first census was done in 1872, Viceroy Mayo, if you remember, in fact, I always say one could actually make a movie of Viceroy Mayo. He died in Andaman. I don't know whether you are familiar. He was assassinated by an Afghan back then. And Mayo was the one who started the census. And for the first time, I think people of Bengal came to know that Bengal holds substantial Muslim population. They had no knowledge, in fact, because the Mughals never had census. It was the British who got the census first. Now, 1872, for the first time, we come to know that Dhaka has a population of 69,000. That was the population. Now, if you tell me, well, they say 16 million, but nobody is sure. But, let's take it 16 million. But they think that by 25, by 2025, it would be around 20 million people. So 69,000 to 16 to 20 million. That's, you can see the transformation of what was the Venice in the eyes of James Taylor got transformed into a mega city. But then it became a mega city, and I'll come back to that, in fact, some of the interesting things that you can get out of mega city. But one can see that it got transformed into a political city as well. People started flocking from way back 17th and 18th centuries and onwards till today. Early on, you had all kinds of people. In fact, you had the Turks, the Armenians, the French, the Persians, you name anyone, in fact. They all used to come to Dhaka. And that reminds you, that tells you that there must have been something there. It's something that Nazim Hikmat said, and I want to flag that so that you can get a sense. You see, when you see people flocking into one area, remembering Nazim Hikmat will help you. You see, a Turkish poet, Nazim Hikmat, has a fantastic line. He says, "If there is honey in my pot, bees will come from Baghdad." So you can well imagine, in fact, there must be something in the Dhaka city which allowed people to come. The honey must have been there of some form. Now, when you have masses of people coming to a city, and these are people, a migrant population after 1947, the Muslim migration. If you take only Dhaka city, there were more Muslim migrants coming into city than Hindu migrants going out. Most of the Hindu migrants actually went out of East Bengal from the rural areas and not Dhaka itself, according to statistics. Now, it became a political city immediately. Not to mention the very birth of Pakistan is connected to Dhaka city. The party which formulated the idea and implemented Pakistan Muslim League was established in Dhaka city, established actually in my university, actually Dhaka University, in 1906. And one of the reasons is the partition of Bengal in 1905. And then onwards, Dhaka city again becomes a serious political city. And I'm talking, if you take 17th century, when Dhaka city became the capital of Subha, Bengal, then you have a gap, but then 1905 onwards, because when the partition was revoked in 1911, Dhaka became immediately a political city because one of the demands that was met was to have an university called Dhaka University, and that allowed another kind of political exercise. Now, it got really energized when Muhammad Ali Jinnah, the father of Pakistan, came to Dhaka. He came only once, actually. He came to Dhaka in 1948 and said this in English, actually, that Urdu shall be the language of Pakistan. He was not a Urdu-speaking person. He was a Gujarati. At home, he spoke English. But then the very statement saying that Urdu shall be the language of the state of Pakistan, got Dhaka back into being a serious political city. And then we see 1952, the language movement. Now, 21st February is the language day, not only of Bengal language, as you know, the UNESCO has declared it to be the International Language Day. So that's the contribution. And I'm saying literally all this is happening inside my university. This is probably the only university in the world where you have a national event. The university hosts a national event where the Vice Chancellor stands, the faculty members literally work for 3 months for this national event where the President, Prime Minister, all the dignitaries come, and this time we had Mamata Banerjee also come in to pay respect, and this happens inside Dhaka University, and Dhaka University is the host. No other university in the world, is engaged in that kind of activity. The second one is in 1971, on 2nd March, Dhaka University, as you know, raised the flag of Bangladesh. The only university in the world which did that. No other universities. The students actually raised the flag and gave it to the leaders, not the other way around. So that's unique also. So one way or other, it continues to be, even now, most of the movement in pre-71 and post-71 all takes place in Dhaka. The fall of the Ershad regime also took place in Dhaka. Not to mention, as I speak today, we are in a kind of a mess, a kind of a political crisis, and Dhaka is at the center of that. Now, you have all this issue of hydrological city turning into a land-centric city. You have an issue of a small, hidden place transforming into a mega city, and not to mention you have a kind of a peaceful place transforming into a political city. Tell you that you are actually reproducing stresses. But then, as I mentioned in my, as the subtitle tells you, stressed, but it is alive, and I will focus on that issue, after I speak a little bit more on the stresses. Now, the paper, when you read, you will see that there are three sections. I talk about the development, I talk of security, and I talk of governance. I transform the concept. In fact, I'm into dialectic, so I take development. If you have development, in the context of Dhaka city and many other cities of South Asia, you can't help talking about maldevelopment. Now, the colonial legacy is quite understandable, transforming a water-centric place into a land-centric, and this is largely because of 3 R's. Now, when we talk about 3 R's, we are all, you are all familiar with reading, writing, arithmetic. That is the 3 R's we talk about. But this is a different kind of 3 R's. It is roads, railways, and rickshaws. So these 3 R's really transformed the Dhaka city. And interestingly, in fact, if you look at the figures, in fact, the first time when rickshaws got in, there were only 6 rickshaws back in 1938. Rickshaw is not even a Bengali word, as you know, it's a Japanese word. 1938, 6 rickshaws were brought to Dhaka by a Bengali zamindar and a Marwari businessman, and now in 2002, it's 400,000. Well, in 2014, 15, no one knows actually. You can tell the story of the crows. In fact, any numbers will do, because if it is less, you can say, well, some have gone outside the city. If it is more, then you can say they have come from outside the city. So you can name any figure, and you can pass by that. Now, it resulted from, as I said, both post-1947 migration, but also post-71, the rural migration, and that also is related to water, because most of the rivers got transformed into either big rivers, the river banks, the people used to live in river banks, it became vulnerable, they had to shift. So flood is one of the big thing that made them come to Dhaka. And most of the rickshaw pullers, there has been some surveys on that, we have found most of the rickshaw pullers are from the river banks, actually trying to get rid of the vulnerability that came to them. Now, there are unintended consequences also, in fact. Sometimes things result in something that which you were not prepared. Now, one of the interesting things that happened with all the people, people coming into Dhaka, and if you look at some of the development figures, one thing came out very prominent, and that is the birth of ready-made garments. Most of the ready-made garments, and this is, I'm talking about early 90s, but now, as you know, as I speak, Bangladesh is the 3rd largest producer of ready-made garments after China and European Union. Well, European Union is a collective. If you take only a country basis, then we are number 2 in the world. and that is largely because of ready-made garments and female workers flocking into Dhaka. And I'll talk about that, how that also helped differently. But you do end up you do see slums, in fact, and there are figures which will tell you the number of slums that we have, and some of the figures really make you think that how is it possible people to leave. I have an old figure of 2005 which tells you 4,966 slums in Dhaka. So you can well imagine. And this is the place, in fact, where also the female workers, large part of them live, and anything can happen in this kind of situation. Now, leaving aside, I don't want to get into details, but if you look at some of the things, if you look at the public toilets, it's really in a bad situation. Whole of Dhaka has a population of 16 million, so you can see you would expect that there will be some services which will help which will help this huge population. But then the entire Dhaka city, in terms of public toilet, it's almost shameful, in fact. Well, 67 public toilets, but only 5 are functioning. Now, when I got this thing, the person who did it, in fact, tried, the research. Now, what do you do with that? What happens to these 400,000 rickshaw pullers? It's really a flood. It's I don't know. It doesn't need serious scholarship to understand the mess. If you look at the West collection also, it's really bad. And I always used to make fun of a former mayor, in fact, former elected mayor. His name was Koka. Koka, as you know, also means child. Okay, so I used to say, you can't blame Koka, in fact. Koka can't grow up because all the garbage that he has to collect from north to south, what can he do, in fact, So, but it's really in a bad situation. But then you also have this developmentality into your head, in fact, and this mentality that modernity is something that you must, go for and you must replicate. That also has created problem. And with that modernity comes the motor vehicles, in fact. So motorized vehicles are looked at modern, whereas the boats, even the rickshaws, they are looked at as not, ancient or something that is not modern. Now, if you look at the space that motorized vehicles take and the number of passengers they transport, and if you look at the buses, it tells you that you need a mass transit system. But then you are thinking of mass transit system when the city has become unworkable. You should think 50 years before. Anybody going to Paris would know the architect of Paris was looking at Paris 100 years from now. Otherwise, why would you have a boulevard like that, in fact? Having a boulevard there tells you that whoever was planning Paris knew that people, you can easily get a sense that your population is going to multiply. Unfortunately, in Dhaka city, developmentality has created serious problem, not only with respect to motorized vehicles and the transportation, but also with respect to housing. And I don't want to get into details. I'm sure you can get a sense of that. And there, once you get that information, and you can easily see the issue of security becomes a serious problem. So you need to focus on insecurity. Now, earthquake could be one. We are yet to have one +7 Richter, unless you look at history. But anyone will tell you that a big one is going to be horrifying. Are we prepared for that? Well, my brother is an architect and he writes on this issue on earthquakes, Professor Nizam, and extensively. And his answer is no way. You are going to get a serious, it's a calamity we are not prepared. It will be as bad as a tsunami or as bad as, dropping a nuclear bomb or Hiroshima or Nagasaki. That I think would be the thing, you can easily say, because it tells you that instant killing would be around 25,000 people, 35% of the building would collapse. So you can imagine, the developmentality that got into this housing and the transport system and all created a kind of a structure which you just have to wait for a big one to come. Now, even if you look at policy of embankment, this is an interesting one. Whole Dhaka is embanked, in fact. And this came way back. There was this World Bank understanding of things back in 1950 that you need to embank. And this was headed by US Army Engineer Corps. So you can easily see the person wanted to solve the problem, and we have all these, the big water development projects, the Dhaka Naranganj Damra project, for example, controlling floods. And then in, I think it was 1996, also we had these big floods and Dhaka was underwater. And the idea was to embank Dhaka, without realizing, as you embank, what happens to the people who are living on the other side of the embankment. That is one problem. And the second problem is about the cloud burst. In 1996, one of the reasons why Dhaka got into trouble also because of the cloud burst, because you never know when that much amount of water would fall on you. People all think that all water comes, people have this idea when they look at Brahmaputra, for example, they think that all would come from Yalung Sampo. Less than 18% of the water actually comes from Yalung Sampo to Brahmaputra. The large part of it, over 70%, is rainwater in the northeast. It's rainwater. But then, you have this sense that, everything is coming from the Himalayas, which is not, in fact. So this rainwater, particularly if you have a cloud burst, and we do have cloud bursts, a serious one, you need to have a configuration, you need to have three things together to have big floods in Bangladesh. And that is the reason, and these three things, they really don't happen all the time. It used to happen every 15, 20 years earlier. So you need, the melting of one, that's one. You need the cloud burst, and then you need the sea level to rise. If these three things are together, then you almost have 4 months of big floods, and that's huge when we talk about huge. Whereas the small floods, which is very good for Bengal, for Bangladesh, because it replenishes the soil, and you have the bumper crops coming up. So somehow this is one thing that I think has created serious problem, because we are not engaged into a kind of science which will help us to rethink this whole idea of embankments, in fact, to see whether we can develop a water-centric cities, if we can put it that way, if that is the case that we need for Bangkok, or if we need that for Dhaka. Now, insecurity also comes from humans, in fact. And one of the big things is, as I said, because it is a political city, Bangladesh is very much into polarized politics. And we have these hartals and, this serious political agitation. And it goes pre-71, pre-47, and even as we talk today, we are having a serious polarized politics. Now, why that is so, I think it is important to understand that. You see, somehow the colonial legacy is still there, because you cannot have you can have a modern state when you have balance of three things. You need to have a political society, you need to have a market, and you need to have a civil society. There has to be some balance of these three, in fact. But somehow, because of the colonial legacy, the civil society is in a very bad shape. Because the civil society got polarized and became violent. And that is, and the reason for that is civil society got engaged into overthrowing the political society. Now that did not take place in the West. In the West, the civil society, which is supposed to do consenting, and it includes the universities, the media, the non-governmental agencies, the sports clubs, they all remained autonomous and independent to political society in the West, but not in South Asia. In South Asia, you had sports, you have soccer clubs actually engaged in politics. The Mohammedan Sporting Club, for example, the Mohun Bagan, for example, they all got engaged in politics. Now, that was not their task. You will never see Liverpool or United Manchester doing that. That's the problem, And you will never see the way, the agitation that takes place in our universities, whether in Kathmandu or in Delhi or in Kolkata or in Dhaka. You will not see that in Oxford or Cambridge. And so the civil society got really transformed. So you end up in a kind of a structure which I'm afraid has not created the kind of modern state that we all refer to. It's very distorted, and that is something that we have not engaged in, because the election that takes place in South Asia, and I will say in almost all the South Asian countries, maybe with certain, good side here and there, all have fallen into electoral democracy. And electoral democracy can actually lead to electoral authoritarianism. Don't forget that Mussolini, Hitler, they were all elected actually. So electoral authoritarianism without having a dissenting civil society, you are having a serious problem. So, you have an electoral democracy which with hardly a substantive democracy that we refer to. Now that insecurity, particularly when it comes to Dhaka city, got another kind of, one can say another kind of entrance, particularly in the late 80s and 90s and now, and this is with the rise of the petrodollars. So what we are now facing is a kind of Wahhabization of Islam. Now this I must very quickly explain. You see, the whole of South Asia, the school, and I'm talking about the Islamic part of the world, the school that is central is the Hanafi School. And the reason for that is the Mughals were also Hanafis. Now the Hanafis, the Imam Abu Hanifa, under whose name you have the Hanafi School, he's the only non-Arab. He's from Persia, he's a Persian. So Abu Hanifa contributed to a much more tolerant mazhab or school of thought. And not to mention Bengal, you also have the Sufis come in. I'm not sure whether people are familiar, but whole this tantric discourse, tantrikism, the birthplace of tantrikism is actually Bangladesh. It's not even West Bengal, it's Bangladesh. So tantrikism I refer to because that's the hyper-tolerant school. You can't be more tolerant than the tantric people. They tolerate anything and everything in the world. And Bengal is actually hyper-tolerant from that point of view. You have all kinds of people, and they love outsiders for some reason, No one knows why, but it's true. One of the reasons why the Sufis could easily get in, not because the Sufis were tolerant. Yes, they were tolerant, but more because people who were in Bengal were equally tolerant, who could allow them to come in and preach. So the Sufi and the Hanafi, this is the central kind of discourse that you see in Bengal and definitely in Bangladesh and in Dhaka. But that got transformed in the late 20th century, but more in the 21st century, with the rise of the petrodollars and the flow of the migrant workers. And they all go actually from Dhaka city, don't forget. And so we have a serious problem with Wahhabization, which you must have seen that in Pakistan it got seriously infected. India also got infected, and I believe also to some extent Bangladesh also got infected, and that is where things have gone to a situation where you now reflect not so much on utopia, but on dystopia, a fearful future. And that reminds me of the author Haruki Murakami. If you remember Haruki Murakami taking cue from George Orwell, because one of the big dystopia that we live with and we enjoy reading about is by George Orwell, 1984. And the Orwellian dystopia was the big brother is watching you. Haruki Murakami writes in 2009-2010 a trilogy, which is an interesting one, a very romantic novel, and he titles his book 1Q84. Q in Japanese 9 is pronounced as Q. So because 1984 is no longer here, we are living in beyond 1984. So he calls it 1Q84 and brilliantly makes it endless. And in this dystopia, he says, well, the big brother watching you is there, but then there is another dystopia that has come up, and this is little people are watching you. And these little people are the thugs, the mastans, and the creepy people, in fact, who can really make serious problems to the world. And we have seen with the 911, with the Mumbai incident, with the Radisson hotel, not to mention in Dhaka, you see these little people, and no one knows, in fact, who is doing what to whom. So insecurity has come to a level which is an issue, and we will come back to that at the end and see how we can get out of it. The final thing is the misgovernance, in fact. Now, Dhaka city got infected by misgovernance also. Well, governance, the reason why we have misgovernance is because it is profitable. It is lucrative, not good governance. Because the moment you go for good governance, you can't get nomination. Nomination you can get if there's a misgovernance, because if you want to get nomination and good governance, then your political party has to be democratic. Your political party must have rank and file, your expenses, your accounts, everything has to be perfect. Tell me one party in South Asia which has that. That's a serious problem. Then you can't really push good things, just like that, in fact. So misgovernance is profitable, both for politics and for business, in fact. You can get contracts, you can, promote your children if you want to, you can get a lucrative job, you can end up even becoming a vice chancellor in some of the universities in South Asia. So, and this is interesting. Now, if you're familiar with the new book that became quite famous, Thomas Piketty's book, Capital, the big one. He talks about something which is very interesting. I'm sure, well, he has no idea about Bangladesh, I'm sure about that, or of Dhaka. But he talks about patrimonial capitalism. Capitalism now, today, is different from the Marxian understanding of capitalism. Marx never thought that it will become patrimonial, that, only you make money for your children. It is immense, and it's endless money, in fact. The sky is the limit, not for the country, not for the city, not for your own village, but for your own family. This is the different kind of capitalism, and I think Piketty got it right by saying it's a patrimonial capitalism, and it's a different kind of capitalism altogether. Now, why that is so? Because you have a political, bureaucratic, business nexus, and it is this nexus that is in charge of Dhaka city. You cannot bypass, things. If you want to get a license in a normal way, even if you want to get electricity in a normal way, the fellow will look at your face only. You just have to use your left hand or right hand or something else to get it done. And that is where the Mastans become powerful. They deliver, believe it or not. And not only somehow Robin Hoods, no doubt about that, but modern day Mastans are more than Robin Hood, in fact, okay? They deliver, in fact, and they have all the connections. You try to get an appointment with a minister, it will not work. You call the PA, it's not going to work. You just ask a Mastan, the Mastan will do it for you. Simple, because the fellow can get 200 people to vote for the minister. You can't get a single person, not even your wife or your husband, to do that. So that's the problem, you see. So they are not interested in you, in fact. They're interested more in the mastans, in fact. And so you have the bureaucratic muddle. And you will see in this paper how Dhaka city is managed or mismanaged by X number of, agencies, in fact. And no one knows who you have to solve, in fact. If you want to clean the garden, another person will say, no, you can't do it. Another agency will say, well, you can do it, but halfway, but not the full way. It's all bizarre, in fact. And I have quoted Mayor, in fact, telling how little power the fellow has. That's the other thing, in fact. Dhaka or Bangladesh or most of South Asian countries, literally the power lies with one person. Even let's take for India, for example. We all talk about Indian democracy, no doubt. I remember this was a month back when you had the World Terrorism Index coming up. And number 3 was Pakistan. Number 6 was India. Number 23 is Bangladesh. And I was always thinking, in fact, well, Pakistan I can understand number 3, in fact, because, they didn't have a democratic tradition. Bangladesh, 23, well, still, worrisome, but 23 is okay. But how is it possible for India to be number 6? It has all the democratic tradition. It's a nuclear power. How is it possible? Nobody is focusing on that, in fact, because, somehow, the focus is on number 3 and number 23, not in the middle. And it's quite funny, in fact. Why you do it? Because I would be more interested to know how even democracy or electoral democracy is not helping even India, in fact, to come to a point where you can say, no, they have succeeded in solving in solving issues of terrorism. But coming back to India, everybody is talking about Narendra Modi. Okay? My fear is, how can democracy be narrowed down to one person? That is serious problem. Just one person. If I say, okay, who is number 2? Let me think, who is number 2? Nobody knows the rank and file of BJP, believe it or not. I don't know, so we need a serious hammering on that, in fact, because as I said, even Hitler and Mussolini were also elected, in fact. So the misgovernance that we see that gets reproduced in Dhaka city also is part of our misgovernance national. And as I speak, as I said, we are facing a serious problem, and this is largely because of the January 5th election, where the majority of the parties did not participate. Not only the opposition BNP, some people have this idea that BNP boycotted. No. Even pro-AL political parties also boycotted. Communist Party of Bangladesh, for example. CPB was never pro-BNP. Dr. Kamal Hossain's party, Dr. Kamal Hossain, as you know, is the head of the Constitution Writing Committee, in fact. Well, he's no longer in the Awami League. He's been thrown out. His party also did not participate. So you had X number of, and moreover, 52% of the member of parliaments got elected without a single vote being cast. Now, that's a serious problem, whether you like it or not, whether you love the party or not, that's a serious problem, okay? Because at the end of the day, as I said with Tagore and Einstein, end of the day is the humans. You have to come today or tomorrow. So you have a serious political chaos, which in Dhaka, it's everywhere, in everyday thing. Some people got used to it. We also got used to it. But now let me end by saying, okay, what is to be done and why we are still alive? Well, Dhaka city is still alive. If you go back to my hidden goddess thing, interestingly, that got transformed into something which is really unique. Dhaka ended up having over 700 mosques. And it is literally called City of Mosque, actually. Now, when you have City of Mosque, and if you're familiar with Islam, you have to pray 5 times. 700 mosques, they have the azan 5 times. Now that's huge, in fact. And that keeps the city alive because, you have to visit 5 times to the mosque and you have all the azan, in fact. They wake you up early in the morning. In the evening, they remind you. So, and mosque is not only where you pray, but you also, meet and you talk and, you do a lot of other things. So, I believe somewhere mysteriously, the city remains alive because even after getting transformed from the hidden goddess into this Muslim majority kind of a city, the azan really keeps you awake. But also with the arrival of the female workers, as I said, hundreds and thousands of that. And for that, I believe one has to credit the NGOs, particularly the big ones, in fact. I think they have done a remarkable job. I don't think you can replicate Bangladesh experience elsewhere. And one of the reasons you can't do that is because the GO and the NGO, actually started their journey together. The BRAC, as you know, well, it's a little bit of pre-71, but more post-72, post-71 after this refugee rehabilitation. They had a little bit of pre-71 because of the cyclone, but it's actually more post-71. So if you take BRAC and, which is now the largest NGO in the world, unthinkable, Sir Fazle Abed's kind of contribution. And you can see the government and the NGOs got together. And then in the 80s, we had this remarkable institution called Grameen Bank with Professor Yunus. So you can see how they made a difference to Bangladesh, and particularly with Grameen and Professor Yunus, because he is the one who championed the cause of women, which is unthinkable in entire history of human. If you look at the entire human history, I think it's a major contribution because this micro credit that you give, 90% are women. And he understood that because he worked in the university. As you know, he's also a prof in Chittagong University, and he gave the microcredit near his university to women, in fact, and found that 100% paid him back, and that in a place called Jobra, and that is how he got his idea that this can be made into something big. And microcredit women really created a kind of empowered women, which if you go to Dhaka and if you talk to any women worker, you will see. Now, that space, something really helped the ready-made garments. So when the ready-made garments came in mid-90s, there were women empowered, who could easily go to Dhaka and make a difference. It created a kind of a structure which I believe is very difficult to replicate. Then you also have something that I always say, that humans are not only political beings. We are not only homo politicus. You see, Aristotle was the first person to understand that we are political beings. That means each and every person has inherent political rights, and those rights are not negotiable. If there is conflict, if there is suppression of that rights, there will be conflict, there will be violence and revolutions, and we have seen. But then humans, later on, Karl Marx, John Stuart Mill, they came and said humans are homo economicus. We are economic beings. That means each and every person has inherent right to work, right to prosperity, right to profit. If those rights are violated, then there will be conflict, there will be revolutions. We have seen that also. But more importantly, in the context of South Asia and in the context of Dhaka and Bangladesh, humans are also cultural beings. We are homo culturicus. And this is something way back Tagore flagged very early on. But in 20th century, we have X number of philosophers. We have Habermas. Well, early on we had Gramsci, but then Habermas, Heidegger, all flag this idea that humans are cultural beings. What it means, that each and every person has inherent cultural rights, in fact. Right to dress up, right to fashion, right to food, right to music, right to poetry, right to dance. If those rights are violated, then there will be conflicts. Now here I flag this very importantly because South Asians and more importantly Bengalis and Well, I said all of South Asians, we are cultural people. And culturally we are plus, you have a surplus of that, in fact. Not politically. And I'll give you one or two figures to help you out. If you look at history, politically we have done really bad. Why? We were ruled by the British 200 years. Well, mostly Bengal. But even then, 200 years of British rule. Then you had the Mughals, in fact, as if the Mughals were Chagatai Turks. Okay? This was a blend of the Mongols and the Turks. The Chagatai Turks ruled us 350 years. Before that, you had the Sultan dynasty, mainly the Afghans. And again, it was 330 years. So 1,000 years actually were ruled by outsiders. Interestingly, Chandragupta Maurya, yes, Chandragupta Maurya, the Chanakya Kautilla being his prime minister, the Mauryan dynasty, that was the first time when you had a kind of a region which you can say was ruled by indigenous monarch. Chandragupta Maurya, then you had Bindusara, and then you had the great Ashoka. These are indigenous monarchs. But then Mauryan dynasty lasted only 130 years. After that, again it went to the outsiders. That tells you that we may not be, or maybe we are over-investing in politics. We need to look at our plus points. And our plus point is culture. When I say culture, it is interesting, in fact. The rag that goes in Lahore, in the music, classical music rag, which is in Lahore, the same rag you will find in Colombo, you'll find in Chennai, the same rag you will find in Dhaka, in Kathmandu, in Delhi. We are connected by the rags, in fact. It's fascinating. Rag means no, you can't even understand the words, in fact, okay? But it will soothe you, in fact. Now, as I speak, Dhaka, as you know, it started only 4 years, but we host the largest classical music festival now in the world. You have so many people, in fact, hundreds and thousands of people, and it took only 4 years to do that. Not to mention, in classical music, Bengal has its own merits, whether it's Ravi Shankar or, if you made Akbar, you name X number of, Bengali classical musicians. But apart from that also, whole South Asians, when it comes to music, they have no problem. They have no problem with Runa Laila, they have no problem with Lata Mangeshkar, with Nusrat Fateh Ali Khan, and no problem with Monisha Koirala. That's what South Asia is all about, in fact. And that is what our strength lies, in fact. Now, if you take Bangladesh very quickly, I will say somehow there's a cultural wave from December to May. It starts from December, it continues to May, and this is a cultural wave which can also be called an anti-fundamentalist wave. It's very difficult to make Dhaka fundamentalist or rigid. When I say fundamentalist, it's not going back to fundamentals. My definition of fundamentalism is this, that it is a singular interpretation of things. When you put everything into one, that is fundamentalism. And that's precisely the reason why I made fun of the doel as national bird. You throw all the birds and you put one bird, definitely that bird is risky. And there's no doubt that it flew all the way from Bangladesh to Nepal, in fact, hiding, in fact. Look at the national animal that we have. Our national animal is Royal Bengal of tiger. I always make fun of this fellow because you can't even shake with Royal Bengal tiger. Now, why on earth would you make this animal national animal, in fact? I don't know. You can't even shake hands, in fact. He's going to eat you up, okay? And that tells you, in fact, with all the national bird, national animals and all, But you look, if you want to get out of the singular interpretation of things, because you can end up with a religio fundamentalism, which is dangerous, but equally dangerous is secular fundamentalism. That is also dangerous, because you are putting everything into singular. Anything singular, because humans, we are not singular. Look at ourselves, look at this room. We are all dressed differently. Not a single person is dressed in someone sitting beside. It is impossible. And that would be abnormal. To be different is normal. Now, if you look at this culturally, and in Bangladesh, 16th December is Victory Day. So it's a celebration. 25th December is Christmas. 1st of January is New Year. Mid-February we have this, beginning of spring we call Pohala Falgun, where everybody is lovely, nicely dressed, in fact, with yellow. Then we have the 21st February, the Language Day. Then 26th March is the Independence Day. Then the Pohala Boishakh in mid-April. Then you have the Pochishe Boishakh, the Tagore's birthday. Not to mention the Workers' Day, the 1st May. And it almost ends with 24th May with Nazrul's, another big poet in Bangladesh, Nazrul's poet. So from December to May, you are blocked. It's a cultural wave. And I always tell my students, what you need to do is to block June to November. And one of those months is actually the month of Ramzan, which is the 1 month food festival month. And if you come to Dhaka, you will know what I am saying. It's actually a food festival month, in fact. I don't know, only Bengalis could do that, I don't know. Anyway, lastly, the modern technology also has made a difference. And this is the television channels and other channels, in fact. And we have this late night talk shows, okay? And we call something, people say, why talk shows are so important? You see, for a Bengali and much of South Asia, and we have this concept called Adda. Bengalis cannot live without Adda. Adda is in our blood, okay? Now, and the reason is South Asians are oral people. I think we forget that. We are not textual people. We are oral people, in fact. We speak. In fact, the entire Mahabharata and Ramayana all were orally done, in fact. It's these oral people. It is only the British who tries to make us textual and created this, funny thing called Anglo-Mohammedan law or Anglo-Hindu law. It doesn't make any sense, actually. It's neither Anglo nor Mohammedan or neither Anglo nor Hindu, in fact. Because we are oral people and we communicate orally, in fact. And that, I think, is important. Unlike the Chinese, in fact. Chinese, as you know, is a textual people. Chinese have only one script, as you know, kanji script. And interestingly, they have all different languages. Well, you can call them dialect, but actually it's languages. But they understand each other when they write. When they write, they understand each other. But not, by the words, how they speak. Because they are textual people. And that is precisely the reason literacy also is very high in this kanji domain. You have 96% in China, and very funnily, both Koreas, which also follows the Chinese tradition, is 99% literacy. Because without writing, you actually can't communicate. Now, but in us, we don't need writing. We are oral people. We talk and talk and talk, in fact. If you are a good talker, you will end up as a politician and a prime minister tomorrow. It should not be at all a problem. But let me end by saying that I think the time has come to revisit Dhaka when it comes to being a hydrological city. And I have seen that, and we have seen that during the last flood, in fact. Even during flood times, people innovate things which is absolutely remarkable. They leave, the laughter. I have seen big floods, in fact. And when I say big, these are really big floods, in fact. But the sense of humor goes there, unstoppable sense of humor. Then you have also a kind of schooling goes on. People go to work, people continue their life. Now that tells you maybe nature is telling us to look into things seriously. And I think the way to recover this particular city called Dhaka city is by going back to its roots, in fact, going back to being a hydrological city. Once that process starts, I believe some of the messes that we have created will go. Thank you very much.